Here we discuss introspection, being, development, and all the good stuff. How does consciousness begin? Well, this is the question that we're all bothered by. In fact, we can look at the question that we have regarding consciousness as another subset of our consciousness into consciousness, meaning we've become so aware of ourselves that we're questioning, how do we become aware of ourselves? Never has a generation been bothered by that. And only the progressive generation that is so conscious, is so aware that they feel the need to postulate what it is that brings them to that consciousness. They want consciousness on their consciousness. And so we may look at our generation or the progression of our era as a true projectile towards an uber-human, like a master conscious being that becomes more aware than ever before. And so if we see consciousness as a development, right, there's the consciousness of the use of hands. Oh, I could manipulate the world with my hands. I could walk terrain wherever and whenever. I could move my body in regard to the world and be in relationship to that. And so you could transcend that by finding consciousness in thought. I'm thinking right now. There's a process to my thoughts. I can move within my thoughts. Just as I can move within my legs and within my arms, I can move within my thoughts. And then it becomes bigger, and I could become more aware of the meta question of my mind, the bigger experience of mine, what it's like to be subjective and what it's like to be conscious. And so there's this developmental strategy that brings us to final consciousness or future progressive consciousness, because it's constantly developing. Why is this important? This is the fundamental question when you want to talk about consciousness. And I find that the importance, the true relevance of consciousness is in its development. The more we discuss consciousness, the more we're becoming aware of it, the more we're developing consciousness itself, the more we're becoming actually more conscious. Okay, so let's say you have your hands in front of you and you're not aware of the fingertips, right? You're not thinking about them. And in fact, when was the last time you thought about your fingertips? And so what if you decided to think about your fingertips in a deep manner, in a conscious manner? Well, what will happen is that you'll become more integrated. You'll become more aware of its subtleties. You'll become actually the fingertips. Till now, there's this abstraction of the fingertips. And so somebody in the trade that deals with the fingertips, the pedicure is a way to enter a deep state of consciousness in that area, in that arena. And that is true with any trade and any dealings. Okay, so what's really happening is that there's an identity shift between selfhood, whatever that is, and the abstraction, the thing that you're trying to connect to. Even though that's the body itself, but because there is no awareness, in a constant awareness, where whatever we're experiencing, there's a sub-layer of just the body itself in that conversation. Meaning, when you're walking, are you thinking about the movement of your feet? Or is there this like motion that's there that you could walk functionally, but still there's an abstraction between selfhood and the feet? And what would happen if one became aware of their walking and the subtleties? Well, first of all, they'll regress to the development of walking itself. If somebody spent hours and on end becoming conscious of their walking, eventually they'll start to enter the earliest states of their development in walking. Eventually they'll reach their childhood struggle with walking, and those first problematic areas of how they developed their walking. What was their struggle in the walk? Was it the balance? Was it the stepping? Was it the fear? They'll start to enter the earliest states of walking because they're becoming aware of what is actually there. So we could see consciousness as just uncovering what already exists. Now, there's another view that we could take on consciousness, that it doesn't necessarily uncover anything because nothing fundamentally objectively exists, but rather consciousness creates the existence. So that if I am not conscious of my walking, I am actually not walking. So how does the task perform? Well, there's this neurological experience, there's a memory, there's the motor memory, and walking is enabled. And there's a proof to this argument that if somebody truly neglected being conscious of their walking, eventually they will lose that connection and they won't be able to walk. If they consciously repress the motor skills, or it's more than the motors, the consciousness, the awareness of walking, eventually all that awareness that was there will fall away and the memory will fall, and so will the ability to walk. And so this is, I would say, a fundamental argument in the nature of existence. What came first, the sub-layers that consciousness reveals, or the evolution of consciousness which brought existence to be. Now, what brought consciousness? Well, that becomes the chasing tail question, because whenever you get to a new layer of how consciousness became, you are becoming more conscious, but then whatever that is that brought that about needs to be brought into consciousness, brought into light, and then there's a never-ending chase here. I wouldn't believe that there's a stop where it's like, okay, we became completely conscious. I think it's a never-ending destination. It's a journey. And so, again, to the question, what's the relevance of consciousness, and why do we need to pay attention to it? Well, we gave the example of walking. Now, we would want to walk better. We would want to be integrated with our walking. If not, we shouldn't walk. Right? We shouldn't go anywhere. We shouldn't move about our world unless we want to be connected to the steps, to the increments that bring us to those places. And if walking is one of those increments, then neglecting that space, neglecting walking, neglecting the medium to those places is also neglecting those spaces. So really, there's a meta question here of wanting to become conscious, meaning wanting to maintain consciousness for our place wherever we are in the world. So that if you're walking to the store, we want to be conscious about the store. And so we want to be conscious about our walking to the store. Now, if we neglect the walking, we also neglect the consciousness, the awareness of being at the store. Because you could only come to the store with these mediums. And there's a process of you in relationship to the terrain that gets you to the store. And so the terrain is like the door of the store. So you could only open the door of this. You could only shop in the store if you open the door of the store. And so the terrain becomes in the realm of consciousness. You're becoming aware of the steps to the store. Now, why would you want to become conscious of the destination? Let us say the store. And that brings us to the question of what purpose does the store have if not for an integration with selfhood? Meaning if I'm taking an item and let's say food and to ingest that food, there's a process that happens. Now, why would I engage in a system that I am unaware of? Or more profoundly, wouldn't I want to attend to that which is waiting, is that which I am attending to with my motor skills anyway? So you're just becoming aware of what it is that it is. And by you becoming aware of it, then you could begin to manipulate the world around you. Right? If you're not aware of your motor movements, you're not able to pick up something or drop something because you just lack the awareness of it. And so the more aware you become, the more powerful you become. And we see the coinciding technological advances with the consciousness advances. And so we become way more powerful because we just became so aware of everything, of selfhood, of objective reality. And so now we could move about in a way that would be baffling to the ancient societies, because our consciousness is baffling to the ancient societies. They just were less aware of what they were experiencing. Now, when you discuss consciousness, I think it's important to put two sides to the coin. On one side, there's the advancement of consciousness, where you become aware of more things connected to subjective self on the broadest scale possible. And so if let's say the body is an example of the closeness to the subjective self, you become aware of each component of the body in a more expansive manner across a longer scale, meaning that they're all integrated. I am more aware of my hand and I'm more aware of my foot, and each awareness affords to the other awareness, so that because I know the subtle movements of my fingers, I could also work with the subtle movements in my feet in unison. So there's a conversation between the two components. Obviously, we're talking on a massive scale here. And so that's one progression in consciousness. Another progression is staying in the element that you're seeking consciousness in. So a common one, which I think is overstimulated, overused, is breathing. Because I think it's overstimulated because there's so much availability, and I think the mind should be the deepest focus of consciousness. The subjective experience of selfhood should be the deepest focus, as opposed to the breathing. Although, obviously, breathing is a great way to expand consciousness. So take breathing. Now, I could imagine a master at breathing, someone that's deeply conscious about it, an opera singer, somebody that relies on their breath becomes more and more conscious in that arena itself and sticks to that arena. The opera singer doesn't become conscious about their feet. They stick to the lungs. They stick to every subtle experience in the lungs and how it manipulates the body and how it interacts with the vocal cords and whatnot. And they understand this at such a deep level that they can map out a sort of world from that space. So it's almost like they don't need to know, become aware. When I say know, become conscious of their feet, because they've learned reality from their lungs. And so if they understood their lungs expand and then contrast, expand and then contract, and then they could see their feet doing the same thing, meaning it starts to afford to everything else. And so we could see consciousness as, taking on new forms of communication and technological advances. And then you could see one form of communication becoming more and more advanced. For example, the telephone is this expansion. Now, instead of going to a portable telephone, what could have happened is people sought out more quality in the telephone and more advancement in the telephone itself. And so instead of doing that, they moved in a different direction, a more expansive direction where people would want to go be mobile with their telephone and so on. But what could have happened is the telephone could have became way more clear and more subtle and more useful, and it could have advanced in itself as opposed to advance in expansion. And so what's interesting is that you'll find actually in this example where with all our advancements, still the telephone conversation doesn't have the clarity that should be expected of such development. It's just, we should expect the highest level of quality in a phone call where we're in conversation almost like we're in person. It's just immaculate. The sound quality and the information that's picked up and the network connections. But what happens is instead we are expanding outward, and so the initial beginnings are not attended to. Okay, so again, these two definitions of consciousness, one that, or not two definitions, but two pathways of consciousness, one that expands on the broadest scale possible, and one that expands in its own criteria, in each individual criteria. So that the individual criteria could expand. You could live. For example, the carpenter could understand the relationship between wood and human, and the relationship between the subtleties in that trade, and understand the world through that. Become so conscious, become so aware of everything about that they understand the things that are not there. And then there's the other person who expands, or the other consciousness, form of consciousness that expands on the broader scale, meaning they're not content with understanding carpentry because there's other trades to become conscious. There's other subjective experiences to become aware of on the broader scale. And there's a certain neglect of the progression of everything. For example, the carpenter is not a conscious of they're not becoming more aware in their trade of their thoughts. The philosopher is. So wouldn't we want to have more awareness in the place that's closer to us, that we can manipulate life far more than the place that's in regards to our motor skills and our hands, that's further removed from ourselves, and at most we can manipulate the world through our movements, as opposed to the intellectual basis that movements rely on. And so what we're really arguing for is a combination of both, so that we're not constantly moving from the telephone to the portable telephone to its later stages. We want to appreciate the levels of consciousness that we obtain before we move to the next level, so that there's an integration between the expansiveness of awareness. I think from this we're gaining a greater understanding of what the purpose of consciousness is, and appreciating where we stand in relationship to consciousness. Thanks for listening, and if you would like to see the video version of this, check out my channel on YouTube.